Hello, and thank you all for joining us today for the latest episode of EnergySource Innovation Stream. We're so excited to have you all call in from all over the world. My name is Emily Burlinghouse, and I'm a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center and a German Chancellor Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Germany. I'm joined today by David Luke Oates, or DL. He is Senior Vice President of Power Markets Research at REsurety, a company that's developed an exciting new methodology that can greatly improve the ability of energy stakeholders to maximize the potential of clean energy assets. This metric, called locational marginal emissions, shines a light on the actual carbon being displaced by a clean resource, rather than its nameplate capacity. All of us that work in the energy transition celebrate clean energy deployment, but we also want to parlay it with displacement. Locational marginal emissions are a great way to bridge that gap. Before we jump in, I have a few reminders for our audience. First, you can follow us on Twitter at AC Global Energy and use the hashtag ACEnergy. We are on the record and currently live streaming on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. We encourage you to share and post about what you hear today. Those in the virtual audience can submit questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. If you are watching on another platform like YouTube, unfortunately, we cannot take your questions. And with that, I'd like to give the floor to DL for his presentation.
Hi, can you hear me? Excellent. Thanks so much, Emily, and to the Atlantic Council for inviting me on to talk about LMEs today. It's a subject I'm really excited about, so I'm looking forward to a great conversation. Let's kick off the slides. So I think I have about 10 or 15 minutes worth of material here to go through, and then we've got lots of time for Q&A after that. Yeah, so as Emily said, my name is David Luke Oates. Everybody calls me DL. I lead the Power Markets Research team at REsurety. So my team is responsible for developing the models and the analytical tools that support all of REsurity's products. So that includes power price forecasting, but also the locational marginal emissions product that we're going to be talking about today. So let's go to the next slide. So I'll just give you a really brief background about REsurety before we dive into the actual topic. So we are about 10 years old at this point. We're a sort of small to medium-sized company based in Boston. I think this 55 figure is a little out of date. We've been growing a lot recently. A lot of the work that we do is in support of clean energy transactions. So wind and solar, we support both sellers and buyers, and we've done about 7 gigawatts of transactions to date. A lot of our work is in the US markets. We also have experience in Australia. And a lot of the work that we do revolves around understanding the risk and variability around variable renewables like wind and solar. Some of that is focused on the financial risk, and some is on the carbon side, as we'll discuss today. So we have 3 software products, LMEs. We also have a map-based tool called Remap that allows our customers to understand the value of clean energy at different locations in the US based on the locational resource availability and locational power prices, and Review, which helps customers understand the value of their clean generation portfolios. We also have some analytics services that are a little more sort of project specific, a little more hands-on, but I won't talk much about those today. So that's REsurety. And if we go to the next slide, the focus of our conversation today are locational marginal emissions rates. And this is something that we've got into in the last couple of years. And as Emily said, the goal of our locational marginal emissions product is to help entities to make better decisions with the aim of decarbonization. So I'll help unpack how they do that in the next few slides. So let's go to the next one. So I thought I would just start with a definition of what locational marginal emissions rates are. So LMEs are really a measure of the potential for clean generation to displace carbon, or of the potential for power consumption to cause carbon emissions. So they're a metric that measures the tons of carbon emissions displaced by a megawatt hour of clean energy injected into the grid at a specific location and at a specific moment in time. So they're locational because they reflect the specific conditions that exist at a particular point in the grid, at a particular node. And those might be quite different than the conditions at a different node because of transmission congestion. And I'll talk a little bit more in the next couple of slides about why transmission congestion matters. Let me just quickly finish on that previous slide before we move forward. So they're locational, they're marginal because they reflect the marginal generation for a particular power market at a particular hour. So the marginal generators are the resources that would need to ramp up in response to an increment of consumption, or ramp down in response to an increment of clean power injection. And the marginal generators can vary considerably from hour to hour. So in some hours, or actually time intervals that could be sub-hourly. So in some time intervals, the marginal generator could be a relatively dirty coal-fired power plant. In other intervals, it could be a relatively clean natural gas combined cycle power plant. And in some intervals, you can even have clean generators like wind or solar that are marginal because they're being curtailed, usually to manage transmission congestion. And I'll just mention that another key aspect of LMEs is that they're quite granular temporally as well. So we're reporting LMEs at an hourly level, but the idea is that this is sort of specific to the conditions at a particular moment in time. Okay, so let's go to the next slide now. So that was kind of an abstract definition of what an LME is. And just to make it a little more clear, I thought I would provide a concrete example. So this chart is from a white paper that I'll link to towards the end of the deck. So this was a white paper that reported results from a case study in ERCOT. So that's the power market that covers most of Texas. And we looked at the LMEs and the carbon abatement from the wind and the solar projects in Texas over a 2-year period from 2018 to 2019. So this chart is zooming in on just 2 solar farms in the far west of Texas for a single day in June, I believe, of 2018. So the bars represent the locational marginal emissions rates for both facilities. So the green bars show solar 1, the red bars show solar 2 in each hour of this example day. And you can see that in the first few hours of the day, the locational marginal emissions rates of both facilities sort of vary up and down as the marginal emissions rates of the system sort of change. So there's slightly different marginal generators. They don't move around too much. But what I wanted to call your attention to was the handful of hours in the middle of the day where there's a big difference between the LMEs of solar 1 and solar 2. So the reason that there's a really big difference between the LMEs of these facilities in the middle of the day has to do with transmission congestion. So I mentioned that both of these facilities are in the far west. So during this period in 2018 and 19, the far west of Texas was experiencing some rapid change. So there was a lot of solar being installed in this region, but not a lot of transmission development. And as a result, the solar power was getting bottled, so it couldn't get out of the far west of Texas to the load centers in the eastern part of the state. And so to use a slightly inaccurate, but not too bad analogy, you can imagine that the transmission system is sort of like a bunch of tubes that are all connected together. And the electrons coming from power plants flow through those tubes and reach load centers where they're consumed. That's not exactly right, but anyway, it's a pretty good model. So the tubes can only hold so many electrons. And once they are full, the system operator, so in this case, ERCOT, will curtail generation on the far side of the tubes to prevent the tubes from getting overfilled. And so during the day in the far west part of Texas, the tubes were getting full. So there was too much solar power coming from this area. And so we were curtailing solar in the far west. So solar 2 happens to be on the wrong side of that congestion. So it has a hard time getting its electrons to serve load and displace fossil fuel generation. And we can see that reflected in the LMEs. So the LMEs for solar 2 fall. Solar 1, even though it's actually geographically quite close to solar 2, is on the other side of that congestion. So during this day, solar 2's output is not able to displace much carbon because it's bottled by the transmission congestion, whereas solar 1's electrons can freely flow towards load and are therefore more effective in displacing carbon. So this is just an example to highlight how much of a difference transmission and location can make in terms of the carbon abatement potential of clean generation. Let's go to the next slide. So I've talked about what LMEs are. I've provided the specific example of 2 solar projects. Now we're going to sort of bring the LMEs together with generation to describe how this affects carbon abatement. Let's go to the next slide. So what I'm showing here is another figure from the same case study. So now instead of showing a single hour, we're reporting average LMEs, generation weighted average LMEs over the full 2-year period of 2018 to 19. And instead of focusing on just 2 solar farms, we're showing a histogram of all the wind and solar facilities in ERCOT or that were operational over that 2-year period. So the x-axis here, again, is the generation weighted LME over that period. So you can think about this intuitively as the average carbon impact of the megawatt hours produced by each facility. And mechanically, we take the LME for the node of each project in a particular hour. We multiply it by the generation from that project in that hour. We sum that up over the whole 2-year period, and then we divide by the total generation. So it's a generation weighted average LME, and it measures the abatement potential of the project. And what you can see is that the generation weighted LMEs range from about 0.25 tons per megawatt hour to about 0.55 tons per megawatt hour. And just for reference, an efficient gas-fired combined cycle resource produces about 0.4 tons per megawatt hour. So the range kind of is close to that, but is quite a bit smaller on the left tail and quite a bit larger on the right tail. So there's about a factor of 2 difference between the lowest abating projects and the highest abating projects. And we think this is a pretty important thing to account for if you're buying clean energy or developing clean energy with the goal of displacing carbon. And I'll just comment that the factor of 2 range is kind of, between the low end of the range and the high end of the range. So we're kind of picking the most extreme values. But even if you look at that, the sort of tighter distribution for wind projects on the bottom, there's about a 30% difference even within the sort of central part of that distribution. So there's quite a bit of variability in the carbon abatement value of different projects. Let's go to the next slide. So now I'm showing actually the same information, but instead of showing it on a histogram, we're showing it on a map. So this is a map of Texas. The triangles represent the wind farms and the circles represent the solar farms. And the color scale is showing the 2-year as generated LME. So that same thing that I was showing on the x-axis of the histograms. So resources that show up as green are relatively effective at displacing carbon. Resources that show up as red are relatively less effective. And I'm showing the information this way because it helps to explain why we're seeing some of the patterns that we're seeing. So the first thing I'll point out is the group of reddish triangles in the far northern part of the state. It's called the Panhandle of Texas. So for those that are familiar with the Texas power market, you'll know that the Panhandle is a particularly windy place. So it's an attractive place to build wind farms. And because of that, there have been a lot of wind farms that are built up there. And the transmission system is stressed. So it's hard to get the wind power out of the Panhandle to load centers in Dallas, San Antonio, and Houston, and sort of the eastern part of the state. So there's this persistent congestion pattern where the transmission system is congested overnight when wind output is high. And this draws down the LMEs for the wind facilities in that location, which is why they show up in red. You can see the dark red circles in the far west part of the state. So that's the same effect that I was explaining a couple slides ago with the 2 solar projects there. And then you can see sort of a smattering of green and yellowish triangles in sort of the central northern part of the state and the southern part of the state. And those are all relatively effective at displacing carbon, but there are some individual project by project differences that are determined by the generation profile of those facilities, which can be different, and also the interconnection voltage. So the voltage at which they inject into the power system, which can also affect their LMEs. Next slide, please. So I've talked about what LMEs are. I've talked about how they impact carbon abatement potential. Now I'm going to step through a sort of simple example of how using LMEs can influence procurement decisions with the goal of decarbonization. Let's go to the next slide. So this is sort of a stylized example that highlights some of the strategies that are possible. And the setup for this is we've got an entity, say a tech company, that has some load. So they're consuming some power, and they're interested in reducing their carbon footprint by procuring clean energy. So in the sort of setup, they're buying their power from the grid. And we're assuming that they have something like a server farm that's located close to a load center. And the consumption weighted LME for that facility is about 1,000 pounds per megawatt hour, assuming that it's a flat consumption profile. So their annual carbon footprint is 1,000 pounds per megawatt hour. Now, if we step to the next slide. So the first decarbonization strategy that we sort of looked at here was an annual energy matching strategy. So they're going to buy clean energy to match the megawatt hours consumed. So they're going to buy enough wind generation so that on the annual average basis, their megawatt hours of clean generation is equal to their megawatt hours of consumption. But they get sort of unlucky with their procurement. So they're buying that clean energy from a resource that has a relatively low LME. And because of that, even though they've matched their consumption with their generation on a megawatt hour basis, they only achieve about a 50% reduction in their carbon footprint. Now, on the bottom, we've provided an indication of the cost of carbon abatement. And I'll just say there's a bunch of assumptions behind this figure, which are documented in the white paper. The sort of an indicative value here, but we've assumed that signing the virtual PPA with the generator costs a little bit more than the value of the power produced by that contract. And so the tech company is kind of paying to achieve decarbonization. And so their cost of carbon abatement in this case is about $19 a ton. Let's go to the next slide. So the tech company realizes, oh, we haven't achieved our carbon reduction. And so they think, well, maybe instead of doing it that way, we will instead procure clean energy on site. So we'll avoid the potential of transmission congestion and hourly and timing mismatch to affect the carbon impact. So we're going to do on-site hourly demand matching. And this is sort of similar to the 24/7 concept where we try and match the clean generation with the load on a hour by hour basis. So with this strategy, we can achieve 100% CO2 reduction because we've dealt with the timing and we've dealt with the location aspect by siting the clean generation in the same location as the load. But the costs are quite a bit higher. And the reason the costs are higher is because in general, it's more expensive to do rooftop solar than it is to do grid scale solar. And that's sort of what we'd be talking about in locating the clean generation close to load. And we've actually assumed some battery operation that's needed to smooth out the temporal mismatches between the flat consumption profile and the variable generation profile of the solar. So it's possible to eliminate the carbon footprint this way, but it's fairly expensive. So if we go to the next slide. A fourth strategy would be to leverage the LME data to select generation projects that have a high abatement potential, and then to use the LMEs to match on a tons basis rather than a megawatt hours basis. So we're gonna target the procurement to match tons rather than megawatt hours. And with this strategy, we of course can also achieve the 100% CO2 reduction. And because we're able to select projects that have a higher carbon abatement value, so on the right end of that histogram that I was showing earlier, we can achieve that decarbonization much more cheaply than we could with the annual energy matching strategy. One more slide. And one other strategy that we'll throw out here is what we're calling LME-driven demand siting. So we talked about selecting clean energy based on LMEs, but perhaps this entity could also site its load center in a different location. So the city of Amarillo, for example, is located in the Panhandle, which has, as we've discussed, particularly low LMEs. So consumption in that location has lower carbon impact than consumption in the eastern part of the state. So if this entity were able to shift its load to the north while also selecting clean generation that abates a lot of carbon, they could reduce their carbon footprint by more than 100% at a relatively low cost. All right, next slide. So just briefly before I finish talking, I'll talk about how we sort of surface this data for our customers. So we offer it in 3 ways. The first are project-specific analyses, where we provide reports for an individual project that provide the LMEs for that project, as well as the generation for that project, and bring them together to report carbon abatement. We also surface this data through our API, and that allows customers to access the LMEs for any hour in the data record that we have going back to about 2018, and for any node. And we're currently serving that data in ERCOT and in PJM, and we're working on rolling it out across the country with CAISO coming next. The third means of delivery that we're actually still working on, I should have noted that here, is through Remap. So we're going to be serving the LME data through our existing map-based tool, so customers can use that in a similar way to how they use prices. So that's how we're offering this data. One more slide. So this is the white paper that I've mentioned a few times through the presentation. You're welcome to visit our website and download it and take a look for some additional detail. And I think the last slide is just contact information. So thanks so much for listening, and I hope we can have a good discussion after this. We're always interested in improving our product and hearing what questions and thoughts folks have. So feel free to visit our website or send us an email at info@resurety.com. And that's all I've got today. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, DL, for this really interesting presentation. I think you hit on some really important and topical points, especially given a lot of the conversations among corporates and power producers and policymakers about the best way to monitor and track and reduce emissions, especially since there's so much variability, on the basis of time and location and type of energy asset. I would like to remind members of the audience that you can submit questions through the Q&A function. But I will start with one that I'm curious about. I think one question that might come up is, isn't this data already being collected by, ISOs or RTOs? So if that's the case, or if that's not the case, how does REsurety go beyond what's already being collected by ISOs and RTOs?
Yes, so that's a great question. So currently, PJM, which is a market operator in kind of the mid-Atlantic portion of the country, is reporting LMEs actually on a 5-minute level for all of their load nodes. So there's about 10,000 load nodes in PJM, and they're reporting that data. And this is fantastic. It is what we want is for this information to be used and useful by as many people as possible, and having system operators report this is probably the best way for it to happen, because they have more visibility into how the markets operate, and all the resources are marginal. They have a better view than anyone else, us included. That said, they're the only ones doing that right now. There's 7 power markets in the US, and they're the only ones that are releasing this information. And even in PJM, there are some gaps that we're helping to fill in. So PJM is not releasing the data for generator nodes, which is pretty important if you want to understand the impacts of wind or solar generators. And we're able to kind of fill in those gaps using our knowledge of the transmission system. They've also only started producing this data in 2021. So we have history going back to 2018, which is valuable, and are working on forecasting as well. So our role here is to kind of add value where we can in this sort of carbon abatement ecosystem. And at present, that means filling in gaps in markets where there is data available, and adding in detail in markets where it's not.
And we just have a question from the audience, sort of building on that. How exactly are you collecting this real-time input data?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I didn't get at all into our methodology here, but I'll say very briefly kind of what we're doing in ERCOT, for example, where we don't get the data directly from the market operator. We have to estimate it. So basically what we collect are the LMPs. So at a nodal 5-minute level, we collect the LMPs for all the nodes. We also have the offers. So the kind of supply offers from the generators. We use those 2 pieces of information to identify which generators are marginal. We also take information about the transmission system in the form of the nodal shift factor matrix, which reflects how much power flows over each transmission element given an injection at each node. So the shift factor matrix, the LMPs, and the costs in each 5-minute interval, and we can sort of do some math with that stuff. One other piece of information is the emissions rates of the marginal generators. We also have that. And we can do some math with that to back out the LMEs at each node.
Got it. Thank you. That was a very comprehensive answer. So hopefully that is satisfactory to our audience. And we have another one here. So NIST has reported that EPA's reported CO2 data has an error band of less than 10% to more than 15%. How do you account for this error band?
So I'm actually not sure which part of the EPA data you're referring to. I'll speculate you're probably talking about the sort of continuous monitoring system that the EPA uses, or sort of to collect emissions data at the power plant level every hour. There's certainly uncertainty in those data, and those data roll up to like the EIA reports, things like Form 923 and 860, as well as eGrid. So we use EIA 923 to obtain our emissions rate data on a unit level. And that, I think, is as accurate as we can get, but I am sure there's noise and uncertainty in that data. There are also a variety of other sources of noise and uncertainty in the data. I will say we're not trying to claim that our data are perfectly accurate. We're just trying to claim that the data are useful to support decision making, and I think they don't have to be perfect to satisfy that. But for sure, there's uncertainty in the numbers.
And what is the certainty that the data being collected is accurate?
Yeah, so this is also a great question. You can imagine sort of, if we were able to quantify the uncertainty of each of our data inputs, we could kind of pass that uncertainty through our system, kind of propagate the error out to our output and provide confidence bounds on the results. We have not done that. There's a variety of reasons why that would be very difficult in practice. It's a great question. So I don't actually have a number for you, but it is a good point. And I'll say that we're at the point of sort of talking qualitatively about the uncertainty in the data, but we don't have a quantitative measurement.
I see. We have a lot of sort of hard-hitting, in the weeds questions from audience members, so I appreciate you taking these. Another one is, how often do you have to update your algorithms to match actual conditions? Are you using any AI to improve your algorithms?
Yeah, so the algorithm that we're using is sort of constantly pulling in new data. So the LMPs that I mentioned are 5-minute real-time LMPs. We pull them in every 5 minutes. The offer curves in ERCOT are 15-minute level data, so we also pull those in every 15 minutes. The shift factor matrices are also they might be 15-minute level. So we're pulling in all of this information all the time and doing the calculation. So it's not like we've got a bunch of assumptions that are static and then we're calculating it over time. We're actually updating constantly. I will say there is a lag, so they're real-time data, but they're released subsequent to real time.
All right. And then one final question, because we're running out of time. You mentioned this very briefly in your presentation, but it's a hot topic, so I want to ask specifically about it. Many companies are already embracing this concept of 24/7 carbon-free electricity, shifting their demand and making purchasing decisions by the hour. Could you elaborate on whether and how you're seeing a similar shift towards metrics like LMEs on the supply side?
Yeah, so I'll say that both 24/7 and LMEs share a motivation, which is that, carbon accounting and the way that people have sort of traditionally made decisions about clean energy procurement is missing a lot of detail, in particular, missing the timing element. So if you're matching your clean generation with your consumption on an annual level, you're not going to get the right answer. So 24/7 and LMEs both recognize that. I think where there's a bit of a difference between the approach is in terms of the treatment of location. And the basic claim with LMEs is that location matters down to the nodal level, not just between markets. I think there's also a subtle difference in terms of the goal. So with a 24/7 approach, the stated goal is to match generation and consumption on a per customer basis. And that's not a requirement in the sort of LME framework. The goal is to manage consumption and generation so as to minimize carbon. And that's sort of the goal that we're focusing on and are trying to support with LME data. So similar motivations, slightly different implementation. And I'll also just say that there's no reason you can't do both. So you can't pursue both the 24/7 goal and measure LMEs.
All right, thank you very much. I think we could continue this conversation for much longer. There are a few additional questions in the Q&A. I would advise audience members to go back, watch the presentation again. There's also the contact details for DL's team there. But unfortunately, we must now come to a close. Thank you everyone for tuning in today, and thank you especially to David Luke Oates for his time and insight. I'd also like to thank everyone who helped put this event together, including Amaya Hadap, Tara Bartley, Allison Gully, Lauren Holland, and Eamon Coughlin. We will definitely be keeping up with REsurety's work going forward. As a reminder, if you'd like to rewatch this event, a cached replay will be available on Atlantic Council Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. We encourage you to share with colleagues and friends. That's all for now, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.